So today we're down here at storage and the memory hierarchy. So let's take a look at that. All right. So we're going to talk about the various ways memory and storage are used and how, in particular, the caching works, which causes code to vary quite a lot in its performance depending on exactly how you access memory. And I don't think this is necessary anymore. I don't think wget is blocked anymore. Anyway, I'm not going to do these demos live anyway. I don't think there's a need to. This is a program that calculates the average of a bunch of numbers. You have 30,000 numbers, and it's going to add all the numbers it finds in this file called mat. And I actually don't know how it gets filled. Total plus equals mat ij. There may be another part of the program that fills it or something. But the important thing for us is the way this loop works. You have a two-dimensional array, mat sub ij, and here you go through the rows first and then the columns. The I and j go in that order. So it's going to go 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, indexing j until it's the end, and then comes back. And when you run this with 30,000 items, it's going to take 2 seconds to go through it all, 2.4 seconds. But if you simply reverse the order of those two loops, so now you go to mat ji instead of ij, now it takes 10.5 seconds. And this is what I wanted to show you. This is the point. Accessing the same array with the same data, but in a different order is much, much slower. And we're going to see why. That's because caching improves performance, but only if you access things in the expected order. So, the memory hierarchy, the fastest thing is registers. There are little storage units directly on the processor itself, but you only have a few of them. The cache is bigger and a little bit slower. Main memory is a lot slower, but a lot bigger. And your flash disk and hard drive and remote storage are, of course, bigger and bigger and bigger, but slower and slower and slower. All right, so level 1 cache sits close to the arithmetic logic unit. Level 2 and level 3 are further away. All right, so your primary storage is registers and RAM. This is mostly what your CPU uses all the time. Secondary storage you can't access directly by the CPU. You have to write files to the hard drive or the SSD and then read them from there. So you don't normally use them interactively during processing unless you really have to, because it'll drastically slow things down. So your criteria are capacity, how much data you can store, how long it takes to retrieve data, and how much data you can get per second. And this is really the heart of today's lesson. Is one measure is how long it takes you to find one item, but the next measure is how much data you can move per second once you've found it. And it can turn out that it might take you a long time to find the one item, but once you've found it, you can rapidly load a lot of items that are near each other on the storage. And so your primary storage register, you see the time cache, and main memory, you see the time, how fast it is, less than a nanosecond, 5 nanoseconds, 100 nanoseconds. That's the issue. So the cache has a few kilobytes. You can use LSCPU to see how much cache you have. Here's what it had in one of my virtual machines. It had level 1 of 2 types, level 2 and level 3. And as you can see, it's not that big, 32K for level 1, 256K for level 2, 12 megs for level 3. So you have enough room to store things temporarily while you're working on them, but not a whole lot of room to work with. And then, of course, secondary storage, SSDs, hard disk, and remote servers are, again, you see, if your flash disk is faster than your traditional hard disk, it also uses less power, but it's more expensive, so you find it in cell phones and portable devices. All right. So that's standard hardware stuff. All right, and then there's locality. There's temporal locality. If you have used some data recently, you're likely to use that data again. That's temporal locality. Then there's spatial locality. If you access data at addresses n and n plus 4, it's very likely to access n plus 8 soon, as just being an address. As you know, arrays are just lined up in memory. We talked about that last time. If you start storing an array at a certain location, it contains integer. Each integer is 4 bytes large. So you'd have from 10, if it starts at 10,000, the first 4 bytes at 10,000 store one, then 10,004 is the next one, 10,008 is the next one, and so on. So it'd be very efficient to just read a bunch of that memory right in order all at once. That's the issue. All right. So in temporal locality, for a program like this, where I have a loop going from I equals 0 to length and adding sum with various arrays as it counts through the arrays, I keep on using I, length, and array over and over and over, and sum for that matter. So those are temporal locality. They're used over and over in instructions, just a few machine language instructions apart. So they're accessed repeatedly, so they should be loaded into cache memory, or indeed registers to make them fast. Then spatial locality, you're reading array sub 0, array sub 1, array sub 2, array sub 3, and modern systems don't load just 4 bytes at a time. They load blocks. If they load, say, 16 bytes of a block size, they'll load 4 integers at a time. So you really don't have to fetch these one by one. You fetch them in blocks, and that makes them faster. And so here's one that loads elements in order. So it's only 2 seconds, and here's the one that loads them out of sequence, so it has to only get 1 element per read of RAM. Even though it could read, say, 4 elements, it only wants the first one, then it skips to another one far away, so you waste a lot of time, and it's much slower. All right, I've only got 1 student online and 0 in the room, so I'm not going to bother with the cahoots. It won't do any good on a day like this. All right, so there's caching. When you need data, it first calculates the address of the data. It then sends the address to both the cache and the main memory, because it might be in the cache, which means you read it recently and saved it in the cache, in which case it'll be able to load it very quickly, and it won't bother at main memory. If it has a cache miss, then it will find it in main memory, and that process is what the main point of this lecture is. So cache eviction is what happens after a cache miss. Data from RAM is then loaded into the cache. Now the cache is typically full, because you keep filling it until it's full, and you only clear it out when you have to, so you have to evict some existing data. This will often require writing to RAM, because the data in cache might have been updated and not yet copied to RAM. So these are 3 types of cache designs that we're going to talk about: direct map, fully associative, and set associative. Direct mapped is simple enough. You divide the cache into cache lines. Each cache line is independent, and it contains 2 kinds of information: the data block, which is a block of data from main memory, typically 16 to 64 bytes, and metadata, which tells you which subset of memory it holds. So you have, say, locating your cache data. Your main memory goes up to here. Your direct map cache only has enough room to store, say, 4 blocks of data. So it takes the lower 2 bits, and everything that was 0, 0 here goes in line 0. That's why since your cache is much smaller than your main memory, each line of cache is going to possibly contain one of many locations in main memory, so you're going to have metadata recording what the high order bits are of this address, but that's going to be a nice mapping of every group of 4 blocks will map to these 4 blocks, as you see by the colors here. So you request a memory address. You get the index portion, which determines what cache line it maps to, which was the last 2 bits in the example on the previous slide. And then you have the rest, which determines, although to be fair, let me be more careful about what I said here. Since these are going to be 4 bytes each, the lower 2 bits of address are contained within this stripe. So to determine what line you're on, you'd actually take bits 2 and 3 from the right. The 2 bits to determine which block you're in, and the last 2 bits determine where you are in the block. So that's why this address is right. There's some bits on the right which reflect an address within the block. Then there's the index bits, which determine which block you're in, and then there's the bits to the left, which determine which part of main memory you're referring to. So all 3 of those are necessary. So now you have metadata that says, does it hold a valid subset of memory? If so, which memory does it hold? It's going to have the high order bits on the tag, so you can reconstruct the actual address. So you take the high order bits are the tag, and the tag is stored here. This V bit stores whether it's valid, says it is valid, and therefore here's that block of data, starting at that address, and then following with this index, and then containing the data after that. So that's the game. So your offset is the lower order bits of the address. That determines how far you go through this block of data to find the one you want. All right, and so you got memory address division. We talked about, here's the index, tells you which one of these lines you're in. The offset tells you how far to go within the line, and the tag tells you which region of memory that line came from. So your direct max example, if you have 16-bit memory addresses and 128 cache lines and 32-byte cache data blocks, then you'll have 6 bits here that can count from 0 to 31, showing how far you go through the block. Then you'll have, looks like 6 bits here, maybe 7 bits. So you have your 128 possible lines of cache memory, blocks of cache memory, and then the tag here is the high order bits, which determine the actual location of this. So that's the game. All right. So here's a cache hit. I'm trying to read this address. So I get the index, which is 3, and I go to this row 3, line 3. Then I have an offset of 111, so I get offset 7 into there. And the tag is here, so I'll find this contains valid data, so in this block contains data. That's a cache hit, so I don't need to go to memory. It found it in the cache. Here's a cache miss. I'm looking for this address. The index is 1. The offset is 0. This could contain the data. The problem is I want 1001, and it was invalid prior to this access. This was originally a 0, so it tells me, no, I don't have that data, so it's going to have to go to memory and load that memory into this block, caching it for use. And so, all right. Here's another read. If I'm trying to read from here, I go down here to load data from memory, but the tag doesn't match. The tag previously had a different value, so this has to be written to memory, and the clean data from memory has to be loaded back in there. All right, so that's writing to cache data. One thing is a write-through cache where you always modify the value in the cache and simultaneously update the contents of memory. And then a write-back cache, where you change the cache but you don't update main memory. This, of course, will be much more efficient. Suppose you have something like that index I, and you're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you keep writing it into the cache. That would be much faster than constantly writing to main memory, which is slow. So you might update the cache value many times and only update the main memory later when you have to. All right. And so you have a dirty bit indicating the data stored in a cache line has been modified, warning you that if you're going to use this cache data block for something else, you must write it to main memory first so you don't lose that information. All right. All right, and so this is a write-back cache using that with a dirty bit. And we've talked about it. I don't think you have to go through it. So if you cause cache misses, compulsory misses are where the program has never accessed that memory location or anything within the same data block. So it never had it. Then there's capacity misses where you can't, you might have referred to it before, but you had to overwrite that line because you had another use for it. You don't have enough cache memory to keep all the copies of all the main memory you're using. And that's conflict, like we talked about before. You go to that line, but some other piece of memory is using that line. These two seem very similar. All right, and so the fully associative cache allows any memory region to occupy any cache location. This is the maximum flexibility, but it's going to have lookup and eviction complexity. Every location needs to be simultaneously considered during every operation. So you can't tell which block of data in the cache you should be looking at. You're going to have to look at them all, which is going to slow down read and write operations. This may be useful, but it's not generally good for general purpose computing. And set associative is the middle ground, which is considered well suited for general purpose CPUs. Each memory region maps to a cache set, but each set stores multiple cache lines. So you have a group of lines available when you have address you're looking for, and you only have to look through a small set of those lines to find the data. All right, so you have several lines here in the same set, so you'll have to hunt through these lines, seeing if the data is in there, and you can simultaneously check every line in the set. All right, so when you load a value into a cache, the cache must decide which of the line options to use. If it has several, it uses the least recently used line. This is a common thing all through computing, that whatever you have not used very lately, you figure you're done with it, so it would be okay to remove that from the fast memory. That seems kind of obvious. All right, and so again, we could go through an example, but I don't think it's really necessary. You get the general idea, I think. All right. And so cache analysis you can do with Valgrind. If you run this, if you shrink them, now you have one takes 2 milliseconds and the other takes 4 milliseconds. So you still see there's a difference between them, but they're much shorter. And you can use Valgrind to see, and it will show you how many misses there have been in the cache memory here. This one had 65,000 misses. This one had 1,000,000 misses. And that's the point. That's why this one takes so much longer. It keeps missing. The data is never in the cache because you didn't use the data nicely in order. So you loaded the first element of an array, and it loaded the next several elements in the cache, thinking you were going to use them next, but you didn't. You jumped way ahead to the next row. So it had to reload again. It was almost never found what it needed in the cache and had to keep going back to main memory over and over. All right, and on multi-core processors, if you have 4 processors, each with their own cache, and then shared cache at level 2, and main memory up here, then you've got a somewhat more complicated situation. So 2 or more cores might have cached the same data in L1 and might have different values for the same block of memory. So you've got a possible conflict here. And they call this the issue of cache coherency. How do you deal with it if 2 of these cores are trying to change the same memory at the same time? And this applies to a lot of systems. I remember this is something I dealt with when I was working in financial work. We had a whole room full of telephone operators, and they were getting phone calls from clients. And in principle, 2 people could call and try to change something about the same record at the same time. So we had a record locking protocol where the first person that started modifying something, that record would be locked, and the second person would not be able to edit it. They get a message saying, you can't edit that file right now, that line of the database right now, to eliminate this problem. All right, so the cache coherence protocol makes sure that the core accessory memory location sees the most recently valued modifier instead of seeing an older version. And so one of the cache protocols is MSI, modified, shared, invalid. You add 3 bits to each cache line. M, it's been modified. S, it's unmodified and can be shared. I, it's invalid. So you have to mark all the cache memory with the situation. So on a read access, if it's in modified or stale, then the cached value is used to satisfy the read. Let's see. M means it's been modified, and S means it's unmodified. Okay, I is the invalid. So if it has been modified, then you have the latest copy. If it's unmodified, you also have the most recent copy, so then you can use it to a read. If it's in the invalid state, the cached copy is out of date, and so now you're going to have to find the new value, find another core that has it in one of the other states, and copy it over before you can use it. If the block is in the modified state and you're writing, then you write to the cached copy of the block. If it's in the invalid or shareable state, then you have to notify the other cores that you're about to write to it, and they're all going to have to set the invalid bit on their block so they know that their copy of data is no longer valid. And all right, you can also have a snooping controller, which snoops on the bus for reads or writes to other blocks, so it knows when somebody's writing to blocks that I have cached, so I know not to trust my cache anymore. All right. And so you get benefits to performance, of course. The other problem is, of course, false sharing. If multiple threads of a single program running simultaneously across multiple cores, then you can have problems synchronizing it, and we'll talk about that later as we move towards understanding how GPUs work. So that's the lecture. I'm going to stop this video.